The Industrial Revolution brought the world technological marvels like the spinning jenny, the coke-fueled furnace, and the steam-powered locomotive. It also brought us flash houses, pickpockets, and roving gangs of child thieves. Today, we're talking about the child gangs of the Industrial Revolution. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what Victorian-era topics you would like to hear about. Right. Now we have 'em reading right with 'em teapot lids. Before industrialization, most boys were ushered into formal apprenticeships. But technology and a new economy eliminated the old ways of life. New industries disrupted families as men went off to factory towns to look for work, often leaving their children behind to fend for themselves. So it was no wonder that many children went out looking for parental figures. It was a matter of emotional and, more urgently, physical necessity. Unfortunately, many of these children wound up in the protective care of so-called ladsmen, who taught them how to steal in exchange for taking a cut of profits. More often than not, the ladsman's cut hovered around 100%, or more. Work that math out.
Good boy.
In his novel, Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens expertly crafted a tale from his first-hand knowledge of the child gangs working the streets of London. Just like in the novel, real child gangs generally worked under the auspices of a Fagin-esque ladsman. But as bad as Fagin was, real ladsmen were often much worse, forcing their wards into harder crimes or even child prostitution. But if morals or basic human decency weren't an issue, being a ladsman could be a very lucrative career.
Put them all back in the book!
Charles King was one such ladsman, who once made the 2021 equivalent of $34,000 in just 1 week from a single 13-year-old pickpocket. Of course, even if you were the best among them, you'd still have to be cool with referring to yourself as a ladsman. Which sounds like a fan club for the big boy restaurants, but hey, that was some serious shilling. Speaking of child exploitation, rather than letting your kid join a free roving street gang, a popular alternative for Victorian parents was to send them off to work. It was take your kid to work day, but leave them there in 19th century London, where children as young as 8 years old were made to work grueling hours under horrific and hazardous conditions in factories and mines. Miners being miners. These child workers were expected to work the same as their adult counterparts, upwards of 12-hour days, 6 days a week. And it wasn't uncommon for regular workplace accidents to involve the loss of wages, limbs, or even life. Fortunately, in 1878, Parliament got their act together, no pun intended, and passed the Factory Act, officially barring the employment of any worker under the age of 10. So, baby steps, figuratively and literally. Child pickpockets constantly lived on the edge. If caught by the police, children as young as 7 were routinely tried as adults. In fact, between 1801 and 1836, 103 children under the age of 14 were sentenced to death. Fortunately, every single one of those executions was eventually commuted to lesser sentences on account of the child's age. One thing you could say about Victorian London was that it was surprisingly progressive. Both boys and girls were sentenced to hard labor for relatively petty crimes. Child thieves were often sent to prison yards to break stones or push wooden wheels to power mills. To the best of our knowledge, not one of those kids grew up to be Conan the Barbarian. Other children as young as 10 were regularly shipped off to a burgeoning English penal colony. British convicts, including children convicted of picking pockets, were sent to Australia for 7 or 12-year stints. And in some cases, their Australian vacations were extended for life. Once settled in their new land, the convicted children would enjoy a bloomin' onion, toss a boomerang, and explore the Great Barrier Reef. Not really, but they were locked in chains and forced into hard manual labor. Oy! In some cases, these kids were forced to build the prisons in which they'd spend the rest of their lives. And they couldn't even build the prisons to their own 6 specs. Pimp my cell. Some lucky juvenile thieves, aka those not sentenced to death or worse to Australia, no offense Australia, were simply publicly whipped or flogged. Public whippings were quite the event in Victorian London. Ironically, instead of being deterrents for would-be thieves, they were hotspots for other pickpockets, due to the large crowds and chaotic nature of public violence, especially against kids. But whippings weren't the only popular stomping grounds of child thieves. Racetracks, fairs, markets, and even funerals were also quite popular with the kids. In 1735, a gang of young pickpockets disrupted a funeral service at Whitechapel Church by running in and yelling, "Fire!" Mourners panicked to escape the building, and tons of pockets were picked in the ensuing chaos. Fun times were had by all. In the 1860s, Bow Street Magistrates Court abolished the whipping of children, but there was no kumbaya change of heart. The court reversed course, not because of some newfound humanitarianism, but because the screams of the children were disturbing the peace, and they received too many complaints from the locals. "Hey buddy, can you keep your floggings quieter?" Child thieves were often homeless, so they turned to so-called flash houses for shelter. Flash houses were not some new viral video sensation, but public buildings or pubs where criminals would keep caches of stolen property. Flash houses had seedy reputations for housing drunks and hardened criminals, along with their child thieves. Think of a flash house as a Victorian Mos Eisley. It wasn't uncommon for 30 children, boys and girls, all under the age of 16, to be living under the same flash house roof. Police referred to flash houses as nurseries of crime, since they often served as incubators for child thieves to segue into harder, more dangerous crimes, like kidnapping, housebreaking, and even cold, calculated murder. In the mid-1800s, an investigative journalist named James Greenwood wrote that children at the time believed stealing was morally just. "They have an ingrained conviction that it is you who are wrong, not them," he wrote. In the eyes of the children, their actions couldn't even be described as stealing. Greenwood reported that the children believed the quote, "You are wrong in the first place in appropriating all the good things the world affords, leaving none for them but what they steal." You may not agree, but at least they had a clear ethos. But it wasn't all about making a living, or even a moral point. Some child thieves were in it just for the thrill, or perhaps that was just an added bonus. Children often bragged about their activities, including one young orphan who told a reporter that picking pockets is the daringest thing that a boy can do. Now that's adorable. Stealing wasn't the only option for the homeless and hungry children of the Industrial Revolution. They could always test the generosity of their community by begging. Of course, begging itself was illegal, and a crime for which even a small child could be thrown into jail. Children convicted of begging were at the very bottom of the prison hierarchy. Child beggars were the constant butt of jeers and ridicule. It was common belief among child thieves that stealing was necessary to build character. Beggars were thought to be morally weak, and that ridicule often meant that the next time that child got locked up, it wouldn't be for begging. Children of the working class in 19th century London had it rough. If they weren't working alongside their parents in factories all day, they were most likely out on the street, in jail, in Australia, or in a disease-ridden flash house. Speaking of the disease, even though the first successful smallpox vaccine was administered in London almost 100 years prior, the Great Pandemic of 1870 sent smallpox cases soaring. The panic that followed led Parliament to enact the Vaccination Act of 1871, which made vaccination mandatory. Parents who did not vaccinate their children were penalized with fines or imprisonment. Unfortunately, even with these precautions, between 1870 and 1980, smallpox went on to claim the lives of an additional 500 million people. In 1880, the Education Act introduced compulsory schooling for children ages 5 to 12, but it was not popular with everyone. Many factory owners feared the loss of revenue with the removal of their never-ending source of cheap labor. However, with the simple mathematics and English that the children acquired, factory owners soon realized that when the children returned to the factories at the age of 13, they were now skilled laborers who could read and make measurements. Profits went up and the education put the children right back where they came from. But at least now, the children of the poorer classes had viable alternatives to thievery or jail. And with the knowledge they received, they had a chance, albeit a small one, in upward social and economic mobility in Victorian England. So what do you think? What would you do if you were a poor child in the Industrial Revolution? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.